She laughed when she said it. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the words themselves, I had half expected something like this for a long time, but the laugh. Light, almost bored, like she was canceling a magazine subscription instead of erasing 38 years of my life. We filed the transfer paperwork this morning, George. That's what my daughter-in-law Diana said. She never called me Dad. Not once in 11 years of marriage to my son. The store is Marcus's now. Fully. You can come by next week to collect whatever personal items you left in the back office. We'll have someone let you in. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was sitting at my kitchen table. The same table where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for 22 years. The same table where my late wife Carol had spread fabric samples when she used to make curtains for neighbors on the side. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. Did Marcus want to tell me himself? I asked. Marcus is busy, Diana said. He's meeting with the new signage company. We're rebranding. Fresh start. She hung up before I could respond. And maybe that was for the best. Because what I would have said next was not something I wanted her to hear. Not yet. She thought it was over. She thought a single morning at a county clerk's office had ended something that had taken me nearly 4 decades to build. What Diana didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had seen this coming for almost 2 years, and I had not been sitting still. Let me tell you about Callaway Hardware. I opened the doors in April of 1987. I was 26 years old, recently married to Carol, and deeply in debt to my father-in-law, who had loaned us $40,000 at 0 interest, because he believed in me more than I believed in myself at the time. The building was a narrow storefront on Elm Street in Denton, Ohio. A town small enough that everybody knew your name, but large enough that you could still build something real if you worked hard enough. I worked hard enough. By the time Marcus was born in 1989, I had paid back every dollar my father-in-law lent me and hired my first 2 employees. By the time Marcus started kindergarten, we had expanded into the space next door. By the time he graduated high school, Callaway Hardware had 3 locations across 2 counties, a small fleet of delivery trucks, and a reputation for being the kind of place where a contractor could walk in at 6:45 inches the morning and get exactly what he needed before the big box stores even turned their lights on. I built that. Carol and I built it together, though she never wanted her name on anything. This is your thing, George, she used to say. I just keep you from making stupid decisions. She was right about that too. She kept me from overpaying for a 4th location in 2003 when the market was shaky. She talked me out of a bad partnership with a supplier in Columbus who turned out to be running a shell company. She had instincts I didn't have, and I was smart enough to listen to them. Carol died in the spring of 2019. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I'm not going to spend much time on that because I still can't talk about it for very long without losing the thread of what I'm saying. What I will tell you is that I was not the same man after. For about 18 months, I was a version of myself that I'm not proud of. Distracted, slow, tired, in a way that sleep didn't fix. That was when Marcus stepped in, and I was grateful. I want to be honest about that. When my son came to me in the fall of 2020 and said he wanted to be more involved in the business, I felt something I hadn't felt since Carol died. I felt like things might be okay. He was 31 by then, had spent several years working in commercial real estate, and he knew numbers. He knew how to read a balance sheet. I thought Carol would have been happy to see it. I made him operations director. I gave him signature authority on vendor accounts. I introduced him to our accountant, our attorney, our 3 store managers. I walked him through everything, the way my father-in-law had once walked me through things, with patience and without reservation. Looking back, I can see exactly when things began to shift. It was gradual, the way these things always are. First, it was small suggestions. We should modernize the inventory system. Fine. We should renegotiate with our main supplier. Also fine. We should bring in a consultant to look at the staffing structure. I wasn't sure about that one, but I went along with it. And then, somewhere in the middle of all that reasonable-sounding change, I started to notice that my name was appearing less frequently on documents, that meetings were being scheduled without me, that when I stopped by the Elm Street store on a Tuesday morning, the manager, a man named Phil, who had worked for me for 16 years, seemed uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. "Everything okay, Phil?" I asked him. "Yes, sir," he said, and looked at the floor. I started paying closer attention after that. What I found, over the following 3 months, did not happen all at once. It came in pieces. A vendor invoice that didn't match our agreed pricing, a payroll entry for an employee I'd never met, a line item in the operating expenses described only as consulting services that totaled just under $40,000 across a 12-month period, charged to a company name I didn't recognize. I wrote that name down, Dayanara Solutions, LLC. I didn't confront Marcus. I'm going to explain why in a moment, but first I need to tell you what I did instead. I called an attorney, not our usual business attorney, who had been introduced to me by Marcus, and who, I was beginning to suspect, had divided loyalties. I called a woman named Ruth Ellison, a corporate attorney in Columbus, whom I'd met years ago at a Chamber of Commerce dinner and always kept in the back of my mind. She was sharp, unhurried, and had no existing relationship with anyone in my life. I sat in her office on a Wednesday afternoon in March, and I told her everything. The vendor discrepancies, the phantom employee, Dayanara Solutions, LLC, the way my name had quietly been drifting to the margins of my own company. Ruth listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Do you still own the majority of the business?" she asked. "According to the original incorporation documents, yes," I said. "I own 60%. Marcus owns 40%. That's been the structure since 2021, when I brought him on as a partner. Has anything been filed to change that?" "Not that I know of," I said. "But I'm starting to realize there are things I don't know." Ruth nodded slowly. "Then the first thing we do," she said, "is make absolutely sure that 60% is airtight. And the second thing we do is start building a very careful, very thorough record of everything you've just told me." That was 14 months before Diana's phone call. I want you to understand what those 14 months looked like from the outside. On the surface, nothing changed. I still came into the office. I still had lunch with Marcus once a week at the diner on Route 9, where we'd been going for years. I still laughed at his jokes and asked about Diana, and nodded along when he talked about his plans for the business. I gave him no reason to think I was anything other than a tired old man, slowly handing over the reins. But underneath that, with Ruth's guidance, I was doing something else entirely. We retained a forensic accountant named David Park, who spent 4 months going through 6 years of financial records. What David found was methodical and ugly. Dayanara Solutions LLC was registered in Diana's maiden name. The consulting fees paid to that company, totaling just over $200,000 across 3 years, had no corresponding work product, no contracts, no deliverables of any kind. It was, in David's professional assessment, a straightforward diversion of company funds. There was also the matter of 3 vendor contracts that had been renegotiated at rates significantly above market, with the difference flowing to a supplier partnership in which Marcus held an undisclosed personal interest. In plain language, my son had been stealing from the business I built. Not recklessly, not obviously, but steadily and deliberately, the way someone does when they believe they will never be caught. Ruth also did something I hadn't thought to ask for, but which turned out to be essential. She reviewed the transfer paperwork Marcus had been quietly preparing. He had, over the course of about 8 months, I've been assembling a legal argument that my cognitive decline, which he had begun documenting through selective observations, and 2 carefully arranged conversations with a physician who had never treated me, made me unfit to continue as a controlling owner. He was planning to petition for conservatorship of my business interests. It was not a quick plan, or a careless one. He had put real thought into it. What he had not put real thought into was the possibility that I might be putting real thought into it too. In February, Ruth filed a series of protective registrations that made any transfer of my ownership stake without my signature and independent legal counsel notification legally void. She did this quietly, through the proper channels, with no fanfare. Marcus's attorney, our old business attorney, as I'd suspected, apparently did not notice, or perhaps thought it didn't matter. That was a mistake. On the morning of the phone call from Diana, I had already been awake for 2 hours. I had made coffee, read the paper, and called Ruth to confirm that everything was in place. She told me it was. She told me the process we had set in motion would begin moving on its own now, and that I should expect things to happen quickly. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I've been waiting a long time," I said. "You have," she said. But waiting was the right call. When Diana called 40 minutes later with her bored, casual voice and her talk of signage companies and fresh starts, I sat at Carol's kitchen table and I let her finish. I let her say every word she wanted to say. And when she was done, I said simply, "I hope Marcus enjoys his morning." She paused for just a second. Maybe she heard something in my voice that she didn't expect, and then she said goodbye and hung up. I sat there for another few minutes. I looked at the photograph on the wall above the table, Carol and me, 1991, standing outside the original Elm Street store on the day we put up the new sign. She was squinting a little into the sun, and I had my arm around her, and we both looked young and slightly terrified in the way that people who are building something real always look terrified. "Okay," I said to no one. "Let's go." 3 days later, at 9:15 on a Thursday morning, Ruth walked into the Elm Street store with David Park and a representative from the Ohio Secretary of State's office. I was already there. I had arrived at 7:30 and spent some time in the back office where I used to keep a small safe, a folding cot for the occasional late nights, and a framed copy of our original business license. The safe was still there. The business license had been taken down from the wall and replaced with something else. Marcus arrived at 9, as he usually did. He came through the back entrance, the way he'd been doing since I gave him his own key, and he stopped when he saw me sitting at the desk. "Dad," he said. The word sounded strange coming out of him, like a tool he hadn't used in a while, and wasn't sure still worked. "What are you doing here?" "I work here," I said. He looked at me for a moment. Then his eyes moved to the door, where Ruth had just appeared. I'm not going to describe everything that happened in the next hour in granular detail, because a great deal of it was legal and procedural and not particularly dramatic in the way that people might expect. There was no shouting. There was no moment where Marcus broke down, or Diana, who arrived 20 minutes later, having apparently been called by Marcus, said something that I could have scripted in advance. What there was, instead, was the particular silence that falls over a room when people realize that the story they have been telling themselves is not the story that is actually true. Ruth presented the documentation. David Park walked Marcus's accountant, a young man who had clearly not been told the full picture of what he'd been helping to facilitate through the forensic findings. The Secretary of State's representative confirmed, on the record, that the ownership transfer Diana had described on the phone had no legal standing. My 60% stake was, had always been, and would remain mine. The conservatorship petition Marcus had been preparing was, Ruth explained with the particular pleasantness of someone who has won something they've worked hard to win, going to create some significant problems for him. Filing a fraudulent incompetency claim against a business partner, let alone a parent, while simultaneously diverting company funds to personally controlled entities, was the kind of thing that tended to attract, sustained, attention from multiple regulatory bodies at once. Diana said, at one point, that they had done nothing wrong. She said it with the confidence of someone who had spent too long in a room where no one disagreed with her. Ruth looked at her with an expression of mild professional interest. "That will certainly be argued," she said, "in the appropriate forum. This place." Marcus sat down on the edge of the desk. He looked, for the first time in years, like the child I remembered, not in a good way, but in the way of a child who has been caught and knows it, and who has not yet figured out what to do with that knowledge. "Dad," he said again. I looked at him. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what you might expect. It wasn't triumph. Exactly. It wasn't the clean, bright satisfaction of a problem solved. It was something more complicated, a kind of grief running alongside the relief, the grief of a man who had wanted something different from this story and was having to accept the one he actually got. You should call an attorney, I said. A good one, not the one you've been using. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. Diana, to her credit, understood the room better than Marcus did. She picked up her bag, took out her phone, and walked toward the front of the store without another word. In the weeks that followed, the legal process unfolded the way these things do slowly, then all at once. The Ohio Attorney General's office opened a civil investigation into the fund diversions. Marcus's undisclosed supplier interest became the subject of a separate inquiry. Our old business attorney, who had apparently been aware of the conservatorship plan if not the financial irregularities, resigned from his practice abruptly and was later disbarred on unrelated but conveniently timed grounds. Marcus and Diana hired separate attorneys, which Ruth told me was a sign that their accounts of events were not going to align. She was right about that. I spent a lot of those weeks at the Elm Street store. Not because I had to. Ruth's team and David Park were handling most of the formal proceedings, but because I wanted to. Phil, the manager who'd looked at the floor when I'd asked if everything was okay, turned out to have been keeping his own quiet notes for more than a year. He brought me a manila folder one afternoon, set it on my desk, and said only, "I didn't know what to do with this. I'm glad you came back." I thanked him. I meant it more than I could say. I also had a conversation that I hadn't anticipated needing to have. Marcus's daughter, my granddaughter, Lily, who was 9 years old and entirely innocent of all of this, still needed to have a grandfather. That conversation happened on a Saturday afternoon at a park, with Marcus present but silent. And it was the hardest thing I did through the whole ordeal. Children understand more than adults give them credit for, and less than adults fear. Lily held my hand and asked if I was going to come to her school play in the spring. I haven't. The civil settlement was reached 6 months later. I'm not going to recite the specific terms, because some of them are under agreement. But I will tell you that the Callaway hardware stores are still standing, still open, still staffed by the same people who showed up every day and did their jobs while people above them were busy making bad decisions. I promoted Phil to regional manager. I hired 2 new store managers, both of them young and hungry in the way I had once been young and hungry. I updated the business license on the wall at Elm Street. I did not put Marcus's name on it. Ruth asked me, at the conclusion of things, whether I felt like justice had been served. It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. She wasn't the type for rhetorical questions. I thought about it for a moment. I feel like the business is going to be okay, I said. That's what I care about most. The people who work there. The customers who've been coming in for 30 years. That's what Carol and I built it for. Ruth nodded. That's probably the right answer, she said. I don't know what Marcus feels now. We don't speak often. When we do, it is careful and short. The way conversations are between people who know that the version of things they had before is permanently gone and haven't yet figured out what the new version looks like. Or if there is one, I leave that door open, for Lily's sake and for my own. Because anger is a heavy thing to carry. And I am 64 years old, and I have better uses for my energy. What I know is this. 38 years ago, I borrowed $40,000 from a man who believed in me, and I built something real out of nothing but time and stubbornness, and a woman who knew when to talk me out of stupid decisions. That thing is still here. That's the whole story. Everything else was just weather. The morning after the settlement was finalized, I drove to the Elm Street store before it opened. I parked out front and sat in my truck for a few minutes, looking at the sign. Same sign I'd put up in 1991. The one Carol was squinting at in the photograph. Replaced twice over the years, but always the same design. My daughter-in-law had told me they were planning to rebrand. Fresh start. The sign still said Callaway Hardware. I got out of the truck, unlocked the front door, and went to work.